just as a general side note, other classes, it would be difficult to rationalize how. I think instead of trying to normalize it, all the classes have different types of ups and downs and characteristics. And if you're a player that is looking for a specific feel that's attached to all the classes so that you have the freedom of choice of flavor, as in you want to be a wizard but you want the smooth learning curve, I don't necessarily am going to say with confidence that, but it is very likely that is not the intent of the design. So this is first and foremost a role-playing game, and a lot of times roles have restrictions and feels that are attached to their fundamentals of their design, as in like a rogue has a certain feel, has encounters and powers themed around that. So if you want your choose your avatar type of thing, and then all the utility of the character is by choice, this is not one of those games. So it also makes it rich and interesting because it forces other people to approach it differently. And that's kind of what I'm doing now for myself. I don't typically play a rogue, but there are incredible benefits for being starting a rogue compared to even my preferred character class types. But I still prefer character class types, even given the benefits of these trade-offs, right? So you get the whole package, and I really appreciate that Cryptic still sticks to some of these building philosophies. I say this because in the end game, that's when the established community thinks about overall output, like the ends justifies the means kind of thing, where, hey, if my output is not as effective as your output, it's not balanced. So I want to make a disclaimer that I am a player that sees myself accessing all of the game, not just the part of the game that I like. So whatever Cryptic thinks about balance is the entire game. So I'm not a person that's gonna make a comment about, oh, what's the best right now in the end game? The best is you. The answer is you, the player. So if everyone thinks the rogue is the most efficient at the end of the game, you can learn to play the rogue. It's not, I don't play rogue, make the wizard stronger. So I'm not that type of player. So you're not going to get commentary from me about comparing and contrasting what is worth investing. To me, I like doing Neverwinter recruitments, and as a reflection of my personality, I prefer to just be able to play all of them. So I am a gamer. I play the game, not only specific parts of the game I like. Yeah, what's the best in endgame now? Yeah, so I'm not going to make commentary on best in slot. I think I should emphasize this on most of my videos when I'm streaming Neverwinter. I'm not a best in slot person. The best in slot person is me, the human being playing the game, not what's in the game that I refuse to play because it sucks, or people say it sucks. And in fact, it's a little bit ironic because I probably would be, if I had to say something about myself, I'm probably more likely to be suited to compare all the classes than asking someone who's a specialist in one of the classes, because obviously they would be most definitely biased and sample size and subjectivity in terms of mastery, right? But as the paradox here is, a player who's more suited to make generalizations because they like to play the entire game are less likely to share those perspectives because it creates that opinion. So for me, I choose to check my proficiency at the door and say that whatever, like, come what may, if you're a player like me, a change in the game is rarely uninteresting. So whenever there's a new flavor or a new trend in the game, when people are arguing about who's best in slot and whatnot, I just hope it just keeps changing. Because if it stagnates, then the game is no longer interesting to me. That's kind of the opinion. So it's a paradox. I argue that the people who are most able to objectively measure, compare, and contrast what's best and what's not are the people incredibly hesitant and unlikely to want to say any of those things, because it promotes bias and prejudice and subjectivity. It adulterates the sampling. So if you have a specialist who goes around and plays a rogue really well, it is unlikely that that person will have perspectives that are accurate with anything else other than that one. So they can definitely tell you reliable things in terms of how they play a rogue and how that compares with everything else around them. But it also means they have an incredibly narrow margin of relevance to the person asking the question. However, if this person knows enough about that person and they know they're like that person, then that advice is probably quite sound. So if you're looking to get into a game, often the most objective thing is to approach someone who doesn't look like they're specialized in anything. I understand how counterintuitive that is. You wouldn't go to like get an advice on your health by asking someone who casually knows a lot about health, sort of. So like that analogy kind of fell apart. So for example, you feel sick. The last thing you want to go to is to an oncologist, right? And ask, oh, you might have cancer, because they're going to talk about oncology. You go to a general practitioner, and that general practitioner knows a lot about a lot of things, because that's what, ironically, they specialize in, being general. And that is a thing. It's a skill. And I personally am more of the general practitioner. I have proficiency in all the most of the parts of this game, but I have no specialization, with a big asterisk, because I do play 3 of the classes I would say relatively above average. The rogue's not one of them. Just as a great digression for these things, because what I'm recording now is specifically to highlight how you get into this game. And if rogues appeal to you, I will likely reflect inexperienced people and maybe slightly above inexperienced people when they first play a rogue. I'm not trying to reflect those people who are specialized in rogue and they just made a rogues because it's the fastest way they can get the Neverwinter recruitment incentives, and then do that again. Those people are probably really good at rogue, but humbly speaking and logically speaking, they will relatively know very little about any other experience and cannot contextualize what it's like to not know how to play a rogue competently. So it's just the human condition, unfortunately. The better you get at doing something and the longer you do it, the less likely you'll be able to unknow it and promote an experience that another person, a new person, would have. And even I am making a big disclaimer. I cover, generally, I make sure to highlight things I can't demonstrate anymore. As in how combat advantage works, you know, how dodge windows work, and you'll hear me make comments as I go through the rogue again. I'll make comments that are going to be obtuse to someone who's not familiar with the game. And that's going to be inherent since I'm not I always cite that I am a legacy player and not a new player. So your experiences may vary, but it's to highlight some of the things. I think the rogue, it's if we consider statistics, it's not it's very acceptable that the rogue is the most plentiful leveling tune in this game because of its incredible starting position and its smooth. I was referring to the learning curve, but it's also its utility. So its utility is high from the very start. Some, like the wizard, I would argue probably has a higher utility at the end, but an incredibly low utility start. So if you're just sticking out and trying to sample it for the first 5 levels, it's not going to give you a great... It's probably low success that the wizard will be highlighted. Wizard is way near the end. I would say level 16 plus. And then you have to get into late game. But the legacy and campaigns are a big step. And those steps come with incredible diminished return. So the 1 to 20 experience is incredibly important to the adoption of this game. Alright. Good skills. Incredible encounter powers. Excellent 1 and 2 dailies. An incredibly reliable daily that's an AoE that is used all the way till end game. And the single target is like serviceable. You don't really use... Generally an AoE daily is like the choice in beginning. And stealth, you don't get attacked in stealth, and then stealth has a double feature to every single skill. The wizard only has certain arcane masteries and whatnot, so it's very touchy. And even the first class feature, you basically just get passive movement speed and extra stats. So it's incredible. I would probably say this is like top 3 when it comes to just off the bat. Alright, so let's rest all the notes, you know, and then we're just gonna go and casually fill in and level up and see if there are any changes. There's a very good chance I just stick with this the entire time. That's how proficient it is, in my opinion. We'll see. Oops. It also involves actually hitting the buttons in the right order. And that dodge roll is so far. Oh, one thing about it, the lash, the single target can miss. That's probably it'll be a learning curve thing for that's something that one has to get used to in this game. It's still like a hybrid game that has a combat oriented feel to it, so you can miss. Not all things are auto targeting or tracking for that matter. So the lash, the only single target encounter that you get in the beginning as a rogue, has proximity. Yeah, so you can like double flurry and it's a clear. Then you can blade, which is also clear. It's good times. And at most, generally, in the beginning, 2 waves, having 2 sets of reliable rotations back and forth on AoE is unheard of in the beginning. I think that's just specifically related to unique to rogues, as far as I can remember. So again, I don't really have comprehensive knowledge of the other 4 classes outside barbarian, paladin, and fighter. What was this down here? I think I was supposed to take this thing. Hey. Oh. Alright. Didn't finish this one. How am I still in combat? Okay. Yeah, generally you'll tend to find me in like whenever I do tomorrow, when the resets, when you go into like the campaigns and stuff in the late game, in the end game, you'll hear me make comments like, of course it's a blade master, of course it's a rogue. And it's not to say about like people's preferences, it's just a lot of times blade masters and rogues are due to the nature of their playstyle, it lends really well to their strengths, and the activity that I typically do leans towards them. The Blade Master offering a satisfying feel that is completely in contrast to the Rogue. The Rogue does the gives you that high efficiency per button, per input efficiency feel, while the Blade Master is incredibly excessive, like Twitch excessive. You're bouncing back and forth and repositioning excessively. Yeah. It's become somewhat of a stigma too, when I don't the whole like it's kind of related to the whole bis like mentality, where people start valuing other individuals' competence by comparing apples and oranges. Like, oh yeah, rogues require low input skill because they have one of the highest ratios in efficiency per input. While it has that, it does trade off in other things. So, and it's not necessarily you're not comparing competency in the same areas. So when an individual makes that generalization, they favor specific selective skills over other skills, like components of input, position, and knowledge, and feel, even like emotional feel, can greatly alter a player's level of competency. And generalizing it to the nature of a design in a closed system it's an incredibly emotional argument, not an objective argument, or even constructive for that matter. How does one avoid some of those generalization faults? You try to get a comprehensive experience. So at the cost of becoming a specialist, right? You become more of a generalist. Then you can probably provide a wider perspective on a player's competence. So I would prefer to evaluate a player based on playing all 9 classes, maybe temporarily, just to gauge their initial competency level, right? I more would rely on that than a player that specializes in one thing. It's often a trade-off that the player either makes consciously or not. Generally speaking, the person that makes the decision consciously would likely be in touch with the limitations of their perspective, opinions, and experiences. So if a specialist chooses to be a specialist, knowing the trade-offs, that specialist would appear far more competent in general than someone who felt and intuitively land on a specialty due to because they like the thing, they just felt it out. That usually lends to a lower level competency that allows them to teach and explain elements of the game to a person who doesn't have the same intuition. It's kind of like the unfortunate paradox of a inherent talented person having the inability to express and teach how to be talented like them. Imagine trying to express that. If something it comes to you second nature inherently, it's difficult to express or instruct another person. It's one of the trade-offs. You got talent, things are easy, you're very good and naturally, right? That's great. That gives you an edge, but it also makes you incredibly unempathetic and unable to instruct on what that is. Without having to engage in an active learning process because you are talented and skilled, you are not actively practicing the skill of teaching or mentoring or even emotionally relating to someone who needs to develop those skills. That would be that's as reasonable as I can be regarding and respectful to those who are incredibly talented. But talent does not lead generally to incredible instructors. Then the people who choose to be instructors are dedicated to instructing. So in a way, they are practicing a skill that the talented people will now be able to associate. In fact, that kind of leads to that common stereotype, right? Of if you can't make it, you become a teacher, kind of thing. Well, it's a chicken or the egg question, and actually the origin of this is because most people choose to develop skills in teaching and mentoring at the expense of becoming an expert or like a specialist. Or I like to use the word specialist because one can be an expert at teaching something and it happens in all fields. I've been pretty close to the top end game of a different field, and you have those makeups. Individuals who are incredibly talented, incredibly smart, very good at doing what they do as a specialist, but since they spend the vast majority of time being leaders and pioneers, they don't have the time to develop how to teach, right? That. And then when people who focus on teaching and communication, it takes up their time to be able to do that. So at the expense of becoming a talented or a very specialized person, you have to divert time to learning how to teach and instruct. So good coaches aren't necessarily great specialized players, but they're great at coaching. Specialized players tend to not be as great at coaching, for example. It's unfortunate, but one person's lifetime is part of the human condition. It's so rare. Oh, did I forget to go down here? It's so rare to be able to do everything at once. If you've met that person, you probably can count them on one hand, right? In human history, you can probably count the number of humans that are ubiquitous, like just have time and skills and biological, physical health to do anything. We're always talking about the potential of a human being to do everything, not literally being able to achieve it, because we're creatures that require rest, interference. We do not compartmentalize well. Our skills tend to interfere with each other. Just the makeup of our biology tends to be a very limiting factor in not just physical things. The mind-body connection is limited to how often we practice and do something. And in fact, there's trade-offs to protect it too. Like some of our protective mechanisms serve as protection, but also can become obstacles. Like, for example, the ability to forget. A lot of times we focus on the things we desire a lot, but one thing that arguably is a protective mechanism is the ability to forget. A lot of times people don't see it as an ability because we emphasize remembering everything. But I don't have to tell you that those people who remember everything have incredible trade-offs in mental health. I am not a genius who remembers everything, but I feel like I have a propensity to remember a lot more, and that has led me to a life working on skills to cope with being able to overcome undesirable experiences and desirable experiences. So great memory comes. I think there are silver linings. For example, if perhaps you have great memory and you have all the resources in the world, so you can diminish negative experiences. That's kind of the idea of like nurturing and providing quote unquote smart people with all the resources they can. I think it's a coincidence though. Generally those resources help minimize negative occurrences, but those negative occurrences create a really terrible obstacle for the lifetime of someone who has great memory, because it's very hard to overcome hardship, and there are inevitabilities in human life, and those things destroy people with great memory. Like, for example, the loss of your parents. Grief can just wreck someone because they can't consolidate their memories so that they can find and focus on things they're willing to accept versus things they don't. And one of them is all the quote-unquote bad things. It happen, like having real discussions about things you may or may not want due to trade-offs. But biology, there's a reason why memory averages around a certain range, right? Because those who are probably incredibly intelligent struggle with something that the vast majority of people did not develop systems for. Like, how do you cope? How do you help someone whose memory is so good you can't possibly empathize with? And then you have a whole population of people who have average memory. They would make systems and solutions to cope and cater to average memory people. So then these people are alone and they have to develop all these coping mechanisms. But because of their quote-unquote advantage, it also comes with disadvantages. Like, if you have great memory, a lot of things about the human condition is you would use that and exploit that at the cost of never developing a solution or a coping mechanism to deal with all the other things. So inherently, incredibly quote-unquote good memory people or high functioning people, they tend to struggle with depression and being able to overcome mental obstacles, because you can't forget those things. You can't consolidate. You can't turn a bad memory into a good memory. For example, I tend to focus on the thing that I talk about when it comes to emotional memory. Emotional memory is tenuous, it's fleeting, it's temporary. It gets changed by your experience. So when something that you felt bad about originally, you start to remember it fondly. That's an aspect of forgetting and consolidating. It's not an aspect of having good memory. When you have good memory and you wish you could remember all the emotional things, any bad memory will replay all the time, and you don't have the flexibility of consolidating or changing how you feel about it because it's so vivid. It's one of my personal things that I share a lot about when it comes to my personal experience, because I have a really hard time sometimes to forget certain things that happen, and it plagues the mind quite a lot. It can become incredibly debilitating. So we have Smoke Bomb. You know, I don't think I just see the rogue gets another AoE at pre-Paragon, and it dazed them, and it gives you combat advantage, but it's 350, right? And then you have blades, 450 persistent. I still don't think it's above stealth double flurry. Smoke Bomb is an interesting one. It's become a non-issue because of the way companion bonuses work, but it's there. Wait, does Smoke Bomb put you in stealth? No. That'd be interesting if it did. Alright. It's a weird grass is greener kind of thing about memory. Obviously I'm gonna say, as a human being, right, as acknowledging the human condition, I would say I still have above average memory techniques and skills with my life. But like most humans, I tend to desire more from it, and often the negatives, the trade-offs, tend to plague the mind far more than the positives over time. And sure enough, having above average memory, or at least above average memory skills, like practical memory stuff, makes it very... One has to develop a lot of ways to cope with things that don't just work for you. So when you fail, it becomes incredibly difficult to cope with it. You're not as resilient. And that's one of the things I tend to highlight. Like, humans have a great way of adapting in general, and obviously I adapted successfully, but I wouldn't say it was successful for a lot of people that I know, especially when they were younger. Some of my former classmates are either not with us anymore or not doing so hot. So whenever I spend most of my time, I work on communication, but generally speaking, the communication revolves around coping strategies and like lifestyle, habit formation, and all that, because largely that's what kept me going. Having great memory is useful when it's useful, or like having the propensity to remember things you need to remember is great, but you also have to get used to constantly learning new coping strategies. And then as someone who likes to maximize what they're doing, if I'm spending most of my time constantly looking at new coping strategies or new trending topics in psychological health and whatnot, I'm using that hyper focus to share that. So while some people may only need one coping strategy because they don't necessarily have the same advantages and disadvantages I have, being able to share that experience is why I feel content creation is incredibly effective. So if you have someone who is a specialist, they can at least tell you all the tools they have, and then allow a person who may not want to be a specialist take one or two things, right? The things that work for them. So I like to think talking about this while playing Neverwinter and all that and video games, it can offer inspiration in unexpected places. Just like one or two things that say, and then the rest can be disinteresting. Because if you're talking to a generalist as a specialist, you only have a narrow margin of appealing to someone who has a lot of interest in specific areas. Just like myself, when it comes to Neverwinter, when someone specifically talks about an incredibly narrow experience, things like oh yeah, just play this because it's better kind of thing, those things I don't resonate with very well because I don't have a specialist perspective. Being able to identify if the person wants general knowledge or specialized knowledge is a great way to sometimes avoid some of that miscommunication. And for myself, I often just ask, have them hopefully be open to qualifying what they're actually asking beforehand. Paradoxically, that's what a person who has generalized knowledge would ask first. A specialist would make assumptions. They would presume you're there to hear about the thing they specialize in. So their expectations would be, oh, you're here, you're asking a question, you should know by now the thing I'm doing is the thing I'm good at. So their logic and their approach would not to be asked to ask what they're asking about, right? I'm saying asking a lot. But the idea is they know what they're good at and they hope you know what they're good at. So they're only asking about that one thing. Makes conversation very straight and narrow and less likely to miss. For myself, I spend most of my time talking about miscommunication and how individuals explain incredibly dissonant topics with other people, and how to avert misunderstanding or embrace misunderstanding and learn from misunderstanding. Because I spend most of my life talking about more than one topic, generally speaking. It's not a fair game. I'm just to emphasize. Depending on certain skills don't overlap. They're not mutually interchangeable. The trade-offs are not the opposites. So like being someone who has generalized knowledge have advantages and disadvantages that aren't the sacrifice of someone who has specialized knowledge. That's generally not how that works. They are antagonistic in some properties, absolutely. However, there are third approaches, fourth approaches, there are hybrid approaches. So it's not zeros and ones. If you're a generalist, you don't guarantee to act exactly the opposite of a specialist. So there are things that a generalist has as an advantage a lot of times that a specialist don't gain in equivalent exchange. For example, it's a really narrow and naive way of looking at life skills. Things like fitness, for example. If you're a great endurance person, it doesn't make you bad at burst, like short burst range things. Some things, it's an oversimplification. So like a generalist is often compassionate. That doesn't necessarily mean a specialist is not compassionate, but it also means that it also has an antagonistic relationship. So it's less likely. A specialist is less likely to develop compassionate skills. It is the idea that they are less concerned with other people that allows them, that enables them to be specialists. Because when you share less concerns with other things, you stay focused on a specific thing. And I like to think, at least the human condition, with enough compassion, sorry, this is my bias, I suppose, with enough compassion, one can develop the competency to be accepting of what they're giving up. You want to be great at one thing, it means you're terrible at a lot of things, but you're definitely good at that one thing. And if you understand that, you can be quite happy, like incredibly happy. You don't have to be aware and learn everything else. It's a way of life, right? So your way of life has to agree with your level of thinking. And I think that's something, luckily, I believe that most humans are able to reconcile with their emotions. So it makes happier, in my opinion, naively, it makes happier specialists, happier generalists, as long as they are competent enough to realize what is enabling, what is not enabling, what they like to do. So being angry that you upset a lot of people frequently as a specialist is something you have to accept. If you're a specialist, you're not going to appeal to a lot of people, right? When you meet strangers, they're gonna look for generalized interest. If you're a specialist, you better hope that person by coincidence is interested in the thing that you specialize in. What are the odds of that happening? A lot lower than someone who has generalized knowledge. So sometimes just knowing that makes someone a little bit less upset, because it produces control. It allows you to line your expectations more appropriately. Not better or worse, it's a trade-off. While I can be cold and calculating, I am still far more relatable as a generalist than a specialist. So what can seem as charisma is also inherent to being a general person, someone who's focused on getting the bigger picture. But that might not appeal to a lot of people. People might want to, a specialist loves nuances, focus. I focus on other things. I'm a specialist in certain things, but not this thing though, not Neverwinter. And I guess I would say the reason why I hyper focus on sending the message of what a live service game requires for our harmonious relationship, it tends to come from the perspective of a generalist. These live service games are aimed at generalist opinions, like generalist preferences. Content would not be as satisfying to a specialist because specialists will selectively be entertained by only the relevant content. As a live service game, trying to enrich and design a game that increases specialist opinions is often the downfall of the game, because the updates and stuff are going to be hits and misses over and over again. But if you design the game specifically to attract generalized interests, anything you release tends to be mid. Tends to be meh, like average. So I always say this content is 5 out of 10. 5 out of 10, sometimes it's 6 or 7 out of 10, but I'm a generalist person. I understand that I have preferences, and it's always going to be around the middle. So whatever they release is always going to be at least average, and that's sufficient. But if you cater to a hardcore, or you attempt to communicate like you cater to a hardcore audience, like a committed audience, and you're operating a live service game, you're gonna get an incredible amount of friction. So you would have to put in plans to try to damage control every time you dip and then every time you succeed. Alternatively, you can just pander to the hardcore and you no longer have a live service game. Because if you pander to the hardcore, you need another way to make money. And that's not selling microtransactions, which is a live service system. So that's like the building philosophy. And keeping and informing people of what the game really is and what kind of system appeals to certain people allows one to become reliable as a source of information. So I would not advertise this game based on the developer's current approach and migration in development to someone who wants a single player experience that is complete and not time gated, or an impatient person. Like if this person is impatient, they like completing things in an efficient manner and whatnot, you can start selecting for personalities and understanding how those personalities would create satisfaction in a game like this. If you're an impatient person, I'm gonna state something obvious, right? But it's not so obvious when you ask yourself, what kind of person would lead to an impatient personality? You start by first stating the obvious, which is live service games do not pander to impatient people. If this person, and what is a facet of impatience, instant gratification. And then you elaborate on instant gratification. What type of form of instant gratification do game design promote, right? Completion. Live service game is inherently dwarfed and trades off the feeling of closure or completion. It's rarely ever that. So you can start expanding on the obvious and characterizing the obvious. And that's where you start building more nuances, right? That's how you become specialized in things. You take the general, then invest the effort to expand the specificity. So if someone comes to you, it's like, oh, what's the end game like? Sorry, this game is not for you anymore. Because the end game is a moving target in a live service game. Yes, this is D&D. This is Neverwinter. And yes, statistically, a lot of people talk about best in slots, stats, and whatnot. But I have to warn you, this game is a live service game. It is not Baldur's Gate 3. So before you go down a road expecting endgame oriented feelings and rewards, you have to know after every module, that endgame moves to the latest module. You will have an unhealthy relationship with the live service game if you think games can be completed and that there's an end elitist tier system. Like, you've made it to the top. There's no top in a live service game. It's a live service game. The top keeps moving. So one day when you're at the top temporarily, the next day the entire system gets revamped and you're having mixed feelings and you're really angry at the developers, but really it's part of the developer's fault, part of the publisher's fault, also part of the player's fault. And it's not the fault that you think, which is what the developer decide to shaft you. Like, no, the developers had a philosophy and they didn't communicate it properly. Communicate like, hey guys, we want you to feel reward about your gear, but remember, this is a live service game. The gear is gonna power creep. Please understand that that's part of the fundamentals of a live service game. It's constantly evolving. So they keep communicating that they will pre-select for individuals who meet that, while alienating those who are looking for it at a cost. Yes, you do lose those players. They do write bad reviews and stuff, but an intelligent person would see that their expectations did not meet a live service expectation. So it happens every day. I'm just saying, like, you go in PE, you sit there for a while, and you hear someone complain about their gear being phased out. Like, well, please do yourself a favor, play a different D&D game, a D&D game that has an end game, and that phrasing needs to go. In my opinion, it's setting miscommunication. So whenever a developer releases something, they do not use such terms anymore because it has, unfortunately, not normalized to live service games. So whenever someone immediately use that term endgame and they're trying to talk about Neverwinter Online, that person's gonna have something upset to tell me about, probably, because their current perspective does not line up with the building philosophy of live service games. And it goes a long way. It's a win-win to communicate that, yeah, I'm sorry, like, our game isn't designed to give you that feeling. If you're willing, play this game with certain expectations and you might end up liking it. You could become a live service fan. For example, I keep Neverwinter as my live service game of choice because it's my source of being attached to the D&D experience in some way, shape, or form, like lore, visuals, what have you, even voice acting and whatnot. But it's not a faithful representation of like the vast majority of D&D things, and I know that. But I came to love live service games because of understanding what it is and what it has to offer. Trying to expect something that it cannot offer or rarely ever offers is often why individuals are upset in a way they don't understand. As in, if you sit around, you're a competent person, you sit around and then you write down, you ask the person, like, you write down what's upsetting about Neverwinter. And then the more common conversation I have a lot is like, well, I worked so hard for this gear and it's like the best gear, and now they just released an update that says the gear is obsolete. Haha, the joke's on me. Why do I even play this game? It's like, well, you could have decided to not get the gear and just wait for the next one. It's like here's a great live service but analogy to life skills. Buying that new car and expecting that next year's car isn't better than the car that you just bought. That's a person who's going to struggle in life emotionally. How do you cater to that? Usually a person develops a new coping mechanism, which the coping mechanism is they buy older cars, like maybe a year or 2 year older cars, to not suffer the diminished return of buying a new car and seeing the delta between your current new car and next year's model, which is going to be above. So that's kind of reflective of live service games. If you think getting that piece of gear right now is too much and doing it justifies you to complain about the next update that like phases out your gear, you have voluntarily decided on doing it for diminished return. Like, if you only value the value, like the literal effectiveness of a gear, you're gonna have a very miserable time with a live service game. Other people, what they do is the ones that cope really well and have emotional stability in a live service game, they know they're gonna get diminished return, but they're gonna try to maximize other things of value to it. So they can talk about the story, how hard it was to get that gear. It's not just the actual item losing its effectiveness, its legacy, its stories. I don't go out helping people thinking that I measure them by the value they would pay back to me, right? I get enough value so that I can offer to help them. I have decided I can help them because I have already decided that I accept what I'm going to get or what I'm likely to get out of it because I have control over it. I want a story to tell other people on how to help someone. That's the value, not banking it on its value that you can't control. So in a live service game, rewards come in are most attractive when they pay out based on the conscious decision of the player. And what is the most common type of live action microtransaction? Fashion. Fashion doesn't necessarily appreciate or depreciate because they inherently elicit sentimentalism, something that isn't easily measurable. And it works. It continues to work. Those who are angry and write scathing remarks like, oh yeah, they don't really build new content, and new game design or innovate, it's all fashion. Play a game that isn't a live service game then. In my opinion, you will hurt other developers less. You will become a more charismatic person, and you yourself will likely be far more happier not playing that game. Like, it's an opportunity for you to find a game that you like to play, as opposed to doing this moral grandstanding saying like, that's not right, this game should be this way. It's like, well, it's not your game. And instead of making a lose-lose situation, you can turn it into a win-win situation. You can leave the game, the developer becomes happier because they don't have a scathing person who doesn't understand what they don't want in a game and what they do want in a game. And it empowers that person to go out and seek what they do want accurately over time. Instead of sitting here constantly suffering, so while you're suffering, you're projecting that to everyone else. It gives you -10 to charisma, and also all your mental skills are gone. You know, it's just it's a really lose-lose situation. In fact, when that person wins, they will still be upset in the long run. It's the human condition. When you do harm to others to make yourself feel better, in the long run, you still feel bad for winning. Unless, you know, you have zero empathy, which kind of is a different entirety problem, which is sociopathy. So that might be applied to a vast minority. But generally speaking, destroying something that you inherently feel obligated to play because you feel upset, that sucks for any onlooker. It's a person who hates to love something when they could choose to learn from it and make themselves happier. Anyone who constantly says, why do they always do this? Happens a lot. Especially in Neverwinter, live service games. Like, oh yeah, they did it again. It's like, yeah, they did do it again. It's a live service game. How do you build habits in a live service game? How do you build habits in a live service game from a developer's perspective? You keep working on a model for like a year and see if it works. It's slow, it's gradual. It's not like arguably one of my favorite franchises of all time now, Like a Dragon. You don't do 6 years all in one game and suddenly the product just creates 6 years of experience. Live service games only have months. Are you expecting to become an expert runner in 3 months? And then every 3 months you become an even more expert runner? You don't. And you have to understand that the development cycle for developers are the same way. They're human beings that constantly iterate on designs until they get it right. Or right as in reach a net positive exchange between the consumer, their bosses, their executives, and themselves, like their lifestyles and whatnot. So the philosophy is incredibly different. It's one of the downsides is it's constantly erroneously attributed to developers. Developers have been lumped together all the time. It's like, no, actually fundamentally developers for live service games have to fundamentally make games, design games, and come up with ideas in a different manner than a development team with a 7-year plan on one title. It's one of the biggest contrasts to date. There might be other versions in the future, I don't know. Maybe AR development or something creates a different balance. But in terms of comparing apples and oranges that happen every single day right now, in my opinion, There's a content influencer somewhere that's applying the philosophy necessary to be successful for a single production game on live services. Every single time there's like some clout chasing clickbait title that says this is not how games should be made, or this game is how modern games should be made, or this is why this proves that modern gaming is flawed, or this is why modern gaming sucks. It's like, first of all, qualify what you mean by modern gaming, because I can almost assure you you're referring to live service games versus single project games. I will be as respectful as possible and say, yes, you probably have a lot of experience with something that's related to those things, and you're entitled to your opinions. But evaluating live service games with a different model of production as a gold standard is incredibly narrow-minded and short-sighted. Your upsetness with your emotions and stuff is perfectly valid. Like, you're upset. I do not contend that. I'm not going to try to gaslight you to knowing how you're upset, or knowing that you're upset. But how you're upset or why you're upset is worth the investment, in my opinion, because you're upset with all the combination of things you know or don't know, emphasis on don't know, or the things you specialize in. It's kind of making your life not so happy. And all I see is two losers. I see a developer and executive or a publisher and a developer group full of people who suffer from the emotional projection of someone who desires something that wasn't ever going to happen, because the developers and the publishers never intended for that to happen. And then they pass it off as a morally justifiable and accepted right. So you can't win against that, right? You can't win against if your opponent is saying that if your opponent is claiming that this will make gaming the best for everyone, how can you beat that when they don't even have a product or have to offer a product that has to actually fulfill those requirements? The only person that has anything to lose is the person or the product loss, because that other person can lose like respect and credibility and stuff, but the product loss is one-sided. Only the developer and the publisher suffers. So an influencer and a content creator who is unjustifiably, in my opinion, no, I take that back, justified but irrationally comparing something and hurting a product, their ability to do that so second-handedly with low effort or with like no fear of consequence or anything over time is because if we look at the facts, they have the least to lose and they have the most to do, which is to damage. And I don't know about you, but I'm a sap. So when I see one person who's incredibly angry, who's wielding their power to demonstrate how angry they are, I see a suffering person who may or may not understand enough to be okay with it. That's more likely to happen than someone who knows exactly what they're talking about and not emotionally compromised. When you're emotionally compromised, it's so unlikely that you are making constructive criticisms. generally speaking, it comes from, the odds are it comes from someone who's not emotionally compromised. And and it goes into the bigger picture, right? Content creators thrive on emotionally compromised states. That's what makes content creation provocative from a statistical standpoint. Obviously, I don't particularly resonate with making contents that are controversial and trying to cultivate controversy as a form of intellectual exchange. However, I'm not ignorant and naive to think that's not the major trend in content creation. I see losers, and my sappy sub wants to always try to minimize the number of losers in anything. It's naive, it's unattainable, and because it's unattainable, it's a mission for life, right? One of the romantic things about having unattainable goals is that you'll, as long as you have the motivation, constantly seek that, you have no short of motivation, right? And I consciously and willingly stick to that because it gives me up in the morning every day. And every day I see I see another influencer capitalizing on clout, on observations that deal with their own personal biases more than constructive criticism, but it's often passed off as constructive criticism. It's almost it makes me chuckle a little when someone says, this is morally not right, or like, this is objectively morally not right. There's nothing about something that's right or wrong that is objective in any way. You could say accurate. Probably that would go a little better, like accurately observed something. But this is the objectively right thing to do? That's an oxymoron. At least personally, I suppose. That wasn't like a hot take or anything. Because what I said was obvious until you're emotionally compromised. So for me, if I'm emotionally compromised, it wouldn't be so obvious anymore, right? So if it's something I care about, or something that really hurts me personally and whatnot, I would have trouble saying what I just said as well. I would have feelings of right and wrong, the things that make me emotionally compromised. Is to be very grounded in understanding the human condition. So whenever, and then we'll take it back to Neverwinter, because this is, take it back to the very beginning, right? Gotta make sure everything is in a neat bow, right? When someone says what's best in slot, that is easily one of the most subjective statements passed off as objective. And what I mean by that is, while the concept of it is theoretically possible, right? Theoretically possible and achievable, the vast majority of the time when someone says something is the best or best in slot, it is coming from a subjective standpoint. And how do I... am I too bold in stating this? No. For one incredibly primary reason. And it's not the reason most people would say, because you would have to work in science for quite a long time to say what I'm about to say. It is an objectively achievable possibility that there are best things in a video game. Absolutely. But the people who present that information have generally not account for selection bias or pre-selection bias for that matter. So when they offer the information, often they fail either to disclose what the pre-selection is and the target audience. So what is your selection for your advice? That is my very first question every time when someone asks me, what do you think is your favorite thing? What do you think is your best? Well, I need to know what the selection criteria is. I need to know what the pool is. If you ham it and just say things without any qualification of what your selection is, nothing is objective after it. You can design easily the best way of determining what a gear is, what gears are most efficient. That's great. That tool itself can measure that. But because of your selection bias and your pre-selection bias, or any premise you have, and you don't disclose that, regardless of how robust and great your method is, it's flawed. It's subjective. The very first, the greatest, obstacle objectivity is, scientific experiments have, is having the ability to have a representative sample. And then I'm only saying representative sample. The most ideal is to have a random sample. And that's an ideal situation. In fact, that's mythical. It's like a unicorn to have an experiment where you can have a random sample. So a representative sample tends to be okay, and you have to qualify the representative example. And then if you know the representative sample, you know the application of that information you're collecting. But rarely is anyone who offers advice ever coming from a mindset of disclosing what the sampling is for. So why do people argue all the time and get salty and emotionally dissonant? Is because whenever someone gives a hot take, they don't qualify what the sampling is at all. What does this apply to? Who it applies to? Who's being tested? What is being tested? Not how it's being tested. It's great. The method works. Everyone's doing it. That's wonderful. It's a rigorous method. But you didn't say who is using that method. And to what is that method being applied to? You have no sampling. You could be the greatest pilot in the world, and you could say because of your greatest pilot experience, you know how to operate a submarine. That introduces sampling, and no one's going to believe you because objectively that's irrational. So you're going to go on this game and you're going to say the best class is a rogue. Who just said that? A rogue player. That creates perspective. It creates disclaimers. It allows the people you're informing to adequately understand selection bias. I am a player that doesn't play any class incredibly well. So now that you know that, I'm going to give you the information I know after playing many classes, because you'll know that I'm more likely to play many classes if I'm not specifically good at one class. It's inherently incredibly important, and it's the root of so many disagreements online in general, in comment sections, and then now it's become so lazy, in my opinion, to a degree that is detrimental. It's become a meme. So now people do this thing where, as a teacher who have taught 30 years, this is my professional opinion. Or as a nurse of 41 years, this is... That's a really dangerous way of qualifying sampling. It's so dangerous. Because years don't measure the quality or anything. It doesn't like... It's still, in my opinion though, it's still more than not qualifying it at all. So I'm grateful that the attempt is being made, I suppose. I suppose it qualifies to some extent. Like, I'm happy that that person is willing to say that. The downside is, since it's used so regularly now, it has normalized as a way to exploit expectations. So now, instead, it just comes off as "trust me, bro." And that's a meme now, right? We know that meme. The "trust me, bro, I've done this for 40 years. Just take my word for it. I've done this for 60 years. Before you look at the profile pic, you look at the history, and they've been doing this for a year. So there's still some time. There's still some work to be done, I suppose, to normalizing sampling bias. One thing I can tell you though, in general, the sampling of one is often not sufficient. So when someone says, this is a fact, I think it's a fact because I researched a lot. You need a lot of people who researched a lot to come to the same conclusion. Just saying, that's sampling bias. It's ironic, but when someone says and reveals that they've done a lot of research, that's a sampling bias. You're the only one that's doing the research. Yeah, it's tough. That's why I feel like sometimes people, wait, what am I supposed to do here? Why are you highlighting this? Oh, ready my companion. Oh, I forgot about this. Hey, what the? You just want me to do this? Oh, okay. There we go. Science sucks. And what I mean by sucks, I don't mean like the concept of science and whatnot. It's incredibly difficult to convince yourself that things are... It's always limited by resources. Science tends to be one that gets crippled by idealistic things and get crippled by pragmatism. So like a great example is what is the success rate that you have to go for in order to be convinced? It's funny listening to you talking about your profession. My educational background is in academia science. So, and I haven't decided if I want to go back to a related field, but I was that naive person that wanted to really focus on teaching and disseminating just critical thinking, as opposed to being like a trailblazer of specialized knowledge and whatnot. So I'm incredibly biased towards raising awareness of the human condition when it comes to thinking and answering and solving problems, than being able to regale you with incredibly specialized and probably subjectively trivial to someone like me knowledge. So like I can't apply those specialized knowledge that specialists are regaling me in, but I do really appreciate that there are people who find incredible satisfaction in willing to sacrifice so much of their generalized skills to be incredibly specialized in something. I had an incredibly unhealthy relationship with that, and I think it's kind of against the human condition, but it's incredibly brave and respectful. Like, those who want to be a specialist is have to like be able to own up and find balance with the human condition all the time, because you give up so many things. Like you become underdeveloped in self-care, health in general. Like all your biological like propensities and predispositions become imbalanced for the sake of your passion for something. And that's on YouTube and stuff. When people do that, it's electric. But to me, I've been there long enough that I can't say that I can form something sustainable like that. In fact, I think it's inherently non-sustainable for the human condition to do so. But you have those periods, right? You have 15 good years or like 20 good years, and then you retire, and then you find, so you know, like humans, I don't think, when become disproportionately unmoderated things, they're really good for as long as they can, but ultimately it's a practice in non-sustainability, being peak at something all the time. And my general concern when it comes to applying this knowledge, I think so, because we had a slight discussion, and but here's the deal. I have two ones that occur the most, right? It's rarer for the I'm not sure if you're the one that's in industry or biotech, but there's also the rare occasion that someone is in academia, which that usually doesn't happen, and then some sort of computer science, but not in the sense of like video game design and whatnot, but more industry computer science, like data science. I'm obviously reflecting on as many possibilities as I can, because I do not have. That's right. Mathematician. Data science is what we had the discussion about. I'm not, unfortunately, I don't have the collective knowledge to remember the specific context. But yeah, it's tough. Being a specialist is well, I'm all in all of this though, like when I, you know, kind of rant about perspectives and knowledge and what's required to be accurate and objective and all that stuff, the goal is to just focus on promoting awareness so that people don't end up being unhappy with their condition. And it's the big disclaimer is because my life has kind of been like that, and I'm internally grateful, and I am who I am because of the many things. And sharing those things can promote, enable people to be able to maybe use the information for themselves. I'm not offering solutions. I'm offering inspiration, of kind of thing. I don't know if I just stole someone's tagline or something, but in my many years of unqualified experience with content creation, I don't necessarily have encountered anyone who says that in that specific context, where I'm not here to offer you solutions. I'm here to talk to you and share with you anecdotally about things that may inspire you to find your own solutions. It's incredibly satisfying when you do. So I don't want to take ownership of, even if my idea, for example, the idea that you encounter, which is not mine really, it's built on the legacy of many. If you gain that inspiration from me and you feel like you took that idea from me, I'm saying I don't own that idea. So it is your idea. And in that way, you enable so many more people. And I understand this is coming from a privileged background. So like there's business involved, like claiming ideas and like needing to make money and stuff. I understand that. But for myself personally, it's far more enabling for me to know that if you were inspired off of me, it is still your idea. Taking ownership of my ideas makes it less compelling for someone to want to embrace the idea, in my opinion, generally speaking. Because a lot of times it's incredibly hyper-focused on being an originator a lot of times, and it can become an emotional barrier to adopting new ideas. Especially ideas that may help someone in the long run. But you know, it's this person's idea. I don't want to steal their idea. I gotta come up with something different. Well, let me tell you. I guess I'll lead to your mathematician, your statistical side. Often, when a lot of people are peddling the same idea and claiming it's unique, it's probably very similar. And it's very similar because there's an element of bootstrapping that's involved in refining in a very effective idea. Generally, a very effective idea tends to have a lot of instances, but that constant urge to trying to reinvent the idea is kind of the trend right now. And often reinventing the idea comes with a lot of red herrings, in my opinion. But being transparent and not trying to place pressure on being an originator all the time, that can be very helpful. At least for me, emotionally, it has become very helpful and sustainable. Like, especially if you're working in the sciences, ooh, publications and whatnot. If there's any profession that has quite a lot of self-imposed standards that lead to a very imbalanced emotional state in someone, it's science. A lot of forms of science and many disciplines that deal with an attempt to create objective value. Well, that's the idea. I don't know how long you were here earlier, but this is coming from a viewpoint of understanding sampling bias or qualifying your sampling. So when you talk about ideas, telling ideas, and talking about what's best, what's not best, what's objectively best, what's objectively measured, it's still susceptible to sampling bias. Who's using it? What is it being applied to? Like, you start at the beginning. What are you sampling? Who's using the tool? The tool can be the greatest thing since sliced bread, but who's using the tool? How, like, what, who's gathering the stuff? So it's bleeds into pretty much every facet of like gaming in general. And I'm specifically talking about gaming because we're playing a video game. But this is very transcribable to, or translatable to most things in life when you try to. Oh, that's when you join. Yeah, sampling is so important. It destroys dreams in science, or like in fields dealing with metrics. Like, man, like I would love to do this experiment, but how the heck am I gonna sample this? Like, oh, this would be great, but where am I gonna get the sample size for this? Or even the appropriate samples for this? It's like, man, it's great that I got this data. How many other people got this data? Well, you really don't know when you're pressured to be unique. So it's like a paradox. It's like creating a feedback loop that's so undesirable. Like, you want to be a specialist and introduce something great that no one else has proven or something. But on the other hand, you're like, if I'm the only one that came to this conclusion or like have studied this, how reliable is it that I'm the only one so far? And your natural hope is you hope that when you publish your findings, you have converging evidence from other people, right? Unfortunately, there's this like necessity and pressure to be originating. So if everyone's keep on originating off of an original discovery, nothing at the end, no matter what you discover at the end, can be offset by the dubiousness of the originator, right? It's kind of like you put out a story and everyone references your one story without validating your one story. So no matter what, no matter how great everything that comes after, it's erroneous based on the source. And when I went to like publish stuff, I just sit there every day. It's like, I think to myself, man, I could inadvertently ruin an unpredictable, unfathomable amount of people's careers unintentionally. That's none of that type of accountability, in my opinion, is ever clear to someone who's inexperienced, young, and haven't worked in a profession that requires that perspective. And that's quite conservatively more than 50% of content creators. The idea that there's no chance that what they say and present could inadvertently ripple and ruin and destroy people's lives because they're doing it to the best of their ability. The intent is pure, absolutely, or pure from a pragmatic standpoint, like they want to get popular or whatever their objectives are. It's pure to that intent, not to the intent of maliciously ruining people's lives and whatnot, but disseminating information as someone who's still wants to be a teacher or a mentor or a life coach or a therapist or something. Your weight of what you do is completely unilateral based on the source. So if you help someone and you hope that that help inspires someone to do many things, you can easily, just as a person who helps someone but inappropriately, and that person goes on to harm a lot of people. And that is a really serious example. But now we talk about disseminating information online. That seems harmless. In science, at least in like the field of biology, that has there's specific examples, but I'm not going to mention them specifically, but there are research and stuff that led to decades worth of misinformation, or decades of not misinformation in the sense that from the perspective of the scientists, because the scientists accepted that it was accurate, so they attempt to interpret and base it off, so they weren't misinforming intentionally. It's just that there wasn't enough clarity to know if the basis for their research was credible enough to move along. So then you stack it, right? They introduce something, and then more people use that as a basis for their research. So it's that stuff is like scarred in my mind, quite both emotionally, like in my heart and my mind all the time. That's some real terror right there. I might be slightly over dramatic, but it's one of the things I talked about memory. It's hard for me to forget. Like, what I mean is I know I can divorce myself from that cynicism, or not cynicism, but concern, because cynicism would deal with, like, it's often in the context of human behavior. In this case, it's not really human behavior. It's just a natural cause of the human condition. So indirectly, it deals with human behavior, but it's like unavoidable. I mean, I don't know. Maybe we'll be replaced by robots or something. But all this discussion about the human condition, I think, to me, naively, is worth contextualizing to what people are doing all the time, because it will help them be a little bit more tolerant, or maybe even accepting of themselves when these things happen to them. Content cannot be objective. They want to be, since their viewers are neither. Yes, exactly. It's like wanting to, yes, exactly. So here's the thing, right? Let's say content creators understand that, right? Let's say these youthful people understand that and accept that they are providing a subjective nature, right? Because they're sacrificing a lot of things in order to be content creators. They are trading off a lot of things to be successful content creators. And then you have products, right? They print it out and they talk about objectivity. So that strikes you as someone that has a dissonance, intellectual dissonance with being a content creator and what qualifies as objectivity. Now say, then you have a content creator that is subjective, right? Like, they don't present themselves as objectivity. Now we're talking about a different group. So let's exclude the low-hanging fruit group. The next group, which talks about subjectivity, that also comes with compromises and trade-offs that they also struggle with, which is the idea that if you are presented and projecting as a content creator, you inherently provide subjective or more subjective information, and your community is therefore a reflection of that. And a consequence of that is that what you say will have counter arguments, will have counter feelings, will attract and detract regardless of what you say. And those content creators struggle with the balance of being dissonant with that, as in they're upset why they don't understand their communities can't read their minds. Well, inherently, content creators are subjective. You will project subjectivity, you will cultivate subjectivity, and therefore one must be able to accept and understand that subjectivity leads to conflict of interest. It results in flexibility, and not cultivating and understanding that and being creating friction to that is also not sustainable. And that happens far more too, and it leads to burnout. The idea that they are constantly having to qualify their subjective things, but really, if they understand what subjectivity is, it wouldn't be as emotionally destabilizing. But it ends up being emotionally stabilizing for the vast majority of content creators, because they have not encountered a personal investment yet that is uncontrollable due to subjectivity. So they attempt then to rectify that dissonance with objectivity. That's the irony here. Or yeah, that is the irony. So they accepted it, but in order to gain control and semblance of control, they rely on counter-arguing based on objectivity. So like things like, oh yeah, I know you guys, I heard a lot of disagreements with my opinion, but hey, here are the facts, all right? And there we go. It's a person who initially have accepted that they are sharing opinions, but then they suddenly try to combat after cultivating subjectivity by relying on objectivity to help protect themselves, like emotionally and intellectually. Those two segments, those two content creators, I would say account for more than 50%. And it sucks because there are only losers in this perspective. There are viewers who don't understand just as much as the content creator who cultivated the community. So without these awareness, you can't have win-win. You rarely have win-win situations. And when I mean rarely, I mean at least over 50% are in this case. I would say less than 1 out of 2 have this harmonious interaction. I do have some specific examples of content creators that did cultivate with the human condition in mind. And those people, the first comments you always hear in a long string of comments, and by always I don't mean literally always, kind of figuratively, like greater than 50%, someone in a long line of all the comments would say, you know what? I love this community because the first thing this community established is that there's room for more information. And that's it. You hear it all the time, like, and it's self-reinforcing in the swarm of just people constantly adding new information onto the pile, right? So that's great, but it doesn't happen very often. And I'm gonna tell you, I know I personally follow 5 of them, and all 5 of them work in a field that, or worked or have worked like professionally in a field that deals with the backgrounds that I specifically cited, that requires these skills, as opposed to originally being a content creator initially, right? And I want that for all the other content creators. Personally, I want content creators to be healthier over time, like being aware that you know, if just having more awareness, because I think it goes a long way to making developing more win-win situations and lose-lose situations. A lot of time is like a combination, like you lose some, you win some at the expense of someone, but that is acceptable, I suppose. Minimizing losers is probably why all this stuff is really interesting to me. Trying to minimize losers. The gaming industry, that's ripe. That's incredibly ripe with these type of discussions. Considering that live service systems are an emerging model and not a standard. I'll use that word standard very loosely. Like it's not dogma yet. It's not normalized yet. So playing a game like Neverwinter leads to a discussion involving these things very often. I'm looking forward to seeing where the inevitable compromise is, the balance of compromise and psychology regarding live service models. Still a work in progress. But that objectivity and subjectivity is applied to this a lot. Never thought about this, honey. Interesting. Would love to discuss more, but I have to sleep. Oh, no worries. Yeah, no obligations. Hey, you keep working. You try oh, okay, I see. Oh man, you gotta keep working, man. You're definitely doing something, you know? Like, arguably, I would say, this is my self-deprecating stuff, right? Arguably, you're doing something that I could not sustain, so that's incredibly admirable and rewarding. Content creation is non-standardized. It's got a lot of growing pains. I hope you're doing well. Like, sorry I haven't inquired about. Hopefully you're doing well and your health is doing well and you like your job. Or find balance. Thanks for chiming in. It's always welcome. I appreciate it quite a lot. Sleep well. Good luck with everything until the next time we talk.